Hello and welcome back, my Lovecraftians. Today we'll be finishing the Dunwich Horror by H.P Lovecraft. Turn on your lights if you're a fan of horror. If not, snuggle in because we are about ready to unleash an eldritch horror upon this. In the end, the three men from Arkham, old, white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky, iron-gray Professor Rice, and lean, youngish Dr. Morgan ascended the mountains alone. After much patience, instruction regarding its focusing and use, they left the telescope with the frightened group that remained in the road. And as they climbed, they were watched closely by those among whom the glass was passed around. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swath trembled as its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness. Then it was obvious that the pursuers were gaining. Curtis Whatley, of the undecayed branch, was holding the telescope when the Arkham party detoured radically from the swath. He told the crowd that the men were evidently trying to get a subordinate peak which overlooked the swath at a point considerably ahead of where the shrubbery was now bending. This indeed proved to be true, and the party were seen to gain the minor elevation. Only a short time after the invisible blasphemy had passed, then Wesley Corey, who had taken the glass, cried out that Armitage was adjusting the sprayer which Rice held, and that something must be about to happen. The crowd stirred uneasily, recalling that this sprayer was expected to give the unseen horror a moment of visibility. 2 or 3 men shut their eyes, but Curtis Whatley snatched back the telescope and strained his vision to the utmost. He saw that Rice, from the party's point of vantage above and beyond the entity, had an excellent chance of spreading the potent powder with marvelous effect. Those without the telescope saw only an instant flash of the gray cloud, a cloud about the size of a moderately large building. Near the top of the mountain, Curtis, who had held the instrument, dropped it with a piercing shriek into the ankle-deep mud on the road. He reeled and would have crumpled to the ground had not 2 or 3 others seized and steadied him. All he could do was moan half inaudibly, "Oh, great God, that. There was a pandemonium of questioning, and only Henry Wheeler thought to rescue the fallen telescope and wipe it clean of mud. Curtis was past all coherence, and even isolated replies were almost too much for him. Bigger than a barn, all made of squirming rope, whole thing sort of shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything with dozens of legs like hogs that half shut up when they step, nothing solid about it, all like jelly, and made a serpent wiggle and ropes pushed together close, great bulging eyes all over it, 10 are pushed close together, great bulging eyes all over it, 10 or 20 mouths of trunk and a sticking all along the sides, big as stovepipes and all a tossing and opening and shutting, all with kind of blue or purple rings, and God in heaven, that bath of face on top." This final memory, whatever it was, proved too much for poor Curtis, and he collapsed completely before he could say more. Fred Fryer and Will Witchin carried him, saying his name on the roadside, and laid him on the damp grass. Henry Wheeler was trembling, turned the rescue telescope on the mountain to see what he might. Though the lens were dissembled, 3 tiny figures apparently running towards the summit as fast as a steep incline could allow. Only these, nothing more. Then everyone noticed a strange, unseasonable noise in the deep valley behind, and even in the underbrush of Sentient Hill itself, it was piping of unnumbered whippoorwills, and in their shrill chorus there seemed to lurk a note of tense and evil expectancy. Earl Sawyer now took the telescope and reported the 3 figures as standing on the topmost ridge, virtually level with the altar stone, but at a considerable distance from it. One figure, he said, seemed to be raising its hands above its head at rhythmic intervals, and as Sawyer mentioned the circumstance, the crowd seemed to hear a faint, half-musical sound from the distance. As a silhouette on the remote peak must have been a spectacle of infinite grotesqueness and impressiveness, but no observer was in a mood for aesthetic appreciation. "I guess he'll say in the spell," whispered Wheeler, as he snatched back the telescope. The whippoorwills were piping wildly in a single, curious, irregular rhythm, quite unlike that of the visible ritual. Suddenly the sunshine seemed to lessen, without the intervention of any dissipable cloud. It was a very peculiar phenomenon, and was plainly marked by all. A rumbling sound seemed brewing beneath the hills, mixed strangely with a concurrent rumbling which clearly came from the sky. Lightning flashed aloft, and the wondering crowd looked in vain for the potent storms. The chanting of the men from Arkham now became unmistakable, and Wheeler saw through the glass that they were all raising their arms in the rhythmic incantation. From some farmhouse far away came the frantic barking of dogs. The change in the quality of the daylight increased, and the crowd gazed about the horizon in wonder. A purplish darkness born of nothing more than a spectral deepening of the sky's blue pressed down upon the rumbling hills. Then the lightning flashed again, somewhat brighter than before, and the crowd fancied that it had showed a certain mistiness around the altar stone on the distant height. No one, however, had been using the telescope at that instant. The whippoorwills continued their irregular pulsations, and the men of Dunwich braced themselves tensely against some imponderable menace, which, within the atmosphere, seemed surcharged. Without warning came those deep, cracked, rancinous vocal sounds, which will never leave the memory of the stricken group who heard them. Not from any human throat were they born. From the organs of man can yield no such acoustic provisions. Rather would one have said they came from the pit itself, had not their source been so unmistakably the altar stone on the peak. It is almost erroneous to call them sounds at all, since so much of their ghastly and fibrous timbre spoke to dim seats of consciousness and terror far subtler than the ear. Yet one must do so, since their form was indisputably through vaguely that of half-articulate words. They were loud as the rumblings and the thunder above which they echoed, yet did they come from no visible being. And because imagination might suggest a conjurable source in the words of non-visible beings, the huddled crowd at the mountain's base huddled still closer and winced as if expectation of a blow. Rang the hideous croaking out of the space. The speaking impulse seemed to falter here, as if some frightened psychic struggle was going on. Henry Wheeler strained his eyes at the telescope, but saw only 3 grotesquely silhouetted human figures on the peak, all moving their arms furiously in strange gestures as their indications and incantations drew near its culmination. From what black wells of archonic fear or feeling, from what unplumbed gulfs of extra-cosmic consciousness or obscure, long-latent heredity were these half-articulate thunder-croakings drawn? Presently they began to gather renewed force and coherence as they grew in stark, utter, ultimate frenzy. Help, help for your other father, Yogsops! But that was all. The pallid group in the road, still reeling at the indestructibly English syllables that had poured thickly and thunderously down from the frantic vacancy beside the shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report which seemed to rend the hills, the deafening, cataclysmic pearl, whose source, be it inner earth or sky, no hero was ever able to place. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone, and a great tidal wave of viewless force and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all the countryside. Trees, grass, and underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal factor that seemed about to asphyxiate them, were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled from the distance, green grass and foliage wilted to a curious sickly yellow-gray, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation came right again. To this day, there is something queer and unholy about the groves on and around the fearsome hill. Curtis Whately was only just regaining consciousness when the Arkham men came slowly down the mountains and the beams of sunlight once more brilliant and untainted. They were grave and quiet and seemed shaken by memories and reflections even more terrible than those which had reduced the group of natives to a state of coward quivering. In reply to a jumble of questions, they only shook their heads and reaffirmed one vital fact. "The thing has gone forever," Artemis said. "It has been split up into what it was originally made of. It could never exist again. It was impossibly in a normal world. Only the least fraction was really matter in any sense we know it. It was like its father, and most of it has gone back to him in some vague realm or dimension outside of our material universe, some vague abyss out of which only the most accursed rites of human blasphemy could ever have called him for a moment on the hills." There was a brief silence, and in that pause, the scattered sense of poor Curtis Whately began to knit back into a sort of continuancy, so that he picked his hands in his head with a moan. Memory seemed to pick itself up where it left off, and the horror of the sights had prostrated him burst in upon him again. Oh my God, that half face on top of it, the face with the red eyes and the crinkly albino hairs, and no chin like the Whatleys. It was an octopus, centipede, spider kind of thing, but was half-shape, man face on top of it. It looked like the wizard Whatleys, only it was yards and yards across. He paused, exhausted, as the group of natives stared in bewilderment, not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Whately, whose wandering remembered ancient things, but who had been silent henceforth, spoke aloud. 15 years agone, he rambled, I heard old Whately say as somehow some day we'd hear a child o' lavies a-calling its father's name on top of old Sentient Hill. But Joe Osborne interrupted him to question the Arkham men anew. What was it anyhow? And however did young wizard Whately call it up from the air of which it came from? Artemis Shoges was very careful. It was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space. A kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from outside, and only very, very wicked people and very, very wicked cults ever try to. There was some of it in Wilbur Whately himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him, and to make his passing out a pretty terrible sight. I'm going to burn his accursed diary, and if you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there and pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings of those Whatleys were so fond of, the beings they were going to let into tangibility to wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to the things we just sent back, the Whatleys raised it from some terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big from the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big, but it beat him because it had a greater share of the outsideness to it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother, but it looked more like the father than he did. And so concludes the Dunwich Horror. What a plot twist. The Dunwich Horror was Whately's twin brother? This whole time? Wilbur Whatley? I was not expecting that. But with most things, you shouldn't expect eldritch horrors to play friendly. This adds a whole new layer, as twins are seen as sacred and demonic in some cultures. Because good twin, bad twin. Was Wilbur really good? But this whole time they tried to protect their own brother from this world. Did Wilbur actually kill his mother? Or was it this demonic twin of his? There's so many questions left uncovered. Please feel free to comment down below what you think happened. My mind is reeling with the possibilities of what the Whateleys were really up to this whole time. I guess that's why H.P. Lovecraft left it to interpretation. I'd love to see your take. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe for more H.P. Lovecraft, as we will have a fan voted for next series reading. What did you think about it? What was your ratings? I thought it was a 10 out of 10 story. It had me on the edge of my seat and it made me upload constantly because I had to know. Just what is the Dunwich Horror? What makes an eldritch being an eldritch being? How can some earthly summons bring such beasts into our world? When will the Necronomicon be mentioned? How will this affect the story of the Call of Cthulhu? So many questions left unanswered. I'd love to know more. And I guess we will learn more, my Lovecraftians. Tune in next time. For now, bye-bye.